All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the channel. We have Antonio Linares here. We are going to be discussing something really interesting today, which is a thesis he has and an argument he's going to be presenting on a company called UiPath and the potential of them being a major Palantir competitor. Antonio, for those of you that don't know, I'm putting his Twitter and Substack in the description, in the chat right now, but it's in the description. He is a pretty brilliant guy when it comes to stocks. I respect his opinion a lot. I met him about a year ago, and the deep dives that he does are honestly phenomenal. I mean, he spends, from what I've seen, weeks trying to understand a company. He drains himself to the core mentally to try to come up with theses about which companies are going to be good, which companies are going to be bad. He was an early investor in AMD and Tesla back in 2014. He's still sitting on some of those gains, and that's what's allowing him to thrive and do what he wants to do and have some financial freedom. So super excited for Antonio to be here. He's going to present his thesis, and we're going to get into it. Antonio, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me again. I'm really excited. And that was an awesome intro. That's way too kind of you. So thanks a lot.
All right. Sounds good. So before you actually present it, can you, let's talk for just a couple minutes before you get into the presentation. What was the kind of motivation to dive deep into UiPath? And then at what point when in your deep dive did you realize, oh, this might be some competition for Palantir? Can you speak on that a little bit? And then we'll get into the presentation.
So I first came across UiPath when I was doing a master's in computer science. And some people from the company actually came to my class to scout some people. And I was looking at this thing like, wow, this is interesting. But I was super busy learning about AI, deep learning. I was thinking about what to do next. And RPA was just interesting, but I never really dived deep into it. So this summer, I decided to do it after spending winter studying big companies and why they became big, like Microsoft, Netflix, stuff like that. And as soon as I got back into tech, I saw this and I said, now's the time to do it. So I actually wasn't expecting it to be a Palantir competitor. I was just hoping to find something that had the potential to scale and become a meaningful business. But I thought, like pretty much everyone else does at first glance, that this is just a boring platform that automates clicks, right? But then as I was looking at the company at sort of deeper levels of fundamentals, I wasn't really thinking about the tech by itself. When I realized that it's a Palantir competitor, I was thinking about what job it actually does for customers and where it's heading and where Palantir is heading. And I could sort of project these two lines out into the future where I see the two companies colliding I think in lower segments of the market. So not where people think Palantir is today, right? I'm going to be explaining that in detail. But it's like, if you look at Palantir at the surface and then you look at UiPath at the surface, you're never really going to think that they compete. But then when you go deep into the two and you think out in 5 to 10 years down the line, then it's easier to see, for sure.
Okay, sounds good. Makes sense. You can share your screen and we can get into the presentation. A lot of people in the chat while you're doing that said they've been thinking about UiPath for a long time. A lot of people have been buying UiPath, so definitely interesting to get into it now. This is also a big stock by Kathy Wood, I believe.
Yeah, I think she's big on it too. So here's the presentation. Yeah, so some members of my audience are intrigued about the stock too. And I'm hoping that this is a valuable time for them, even if not seen from the perspective of being a Palantir competitor.
By the way, do you pay for Canva Pro?
I don't.
You don't? Okay, so Canva, the basic version is enough for you. Okay, I'm always curious because I love Canva as a account. I'm always curious. All right.
By the way, I don't get sponsored or anything, but it's pretty awesome for content. So
it's amazing.
Hey, Canva.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you guys see the screen now completely?
Yep, we're good to go. Yep.
So this is a presentation in which I'm going to talk about the competitive dynamics between UiPath and Palantir. First things first, I can't promise you at the end of this presentation that you will see whether Palantir and UiPath compete or not. But what I can promise you is you will gain a new perspective on Palantir and UiPath, which I think will likely make you a better investor. One thing that I do actively is try and break my thesis and sort of spin them around and look at them in different ways so that when the market throws a new narrative at me, which is a matter of time, I'm able to navigate that narrative, right? So an example, going back to what you were saying about my AMD holdings, I think last year, remember that the market was saying, look, there's a chip shortage, therefore you should sell this company, right? And we're way past that. And actually, if you look at lower, deeper levels of the fundamental truth of what a company is, and specifically AMD, you would have never sold, right? So this is where we're heading. This is what I can promise that you will gain. You will get stronger. You will be a better investor after listening to this. So I'm going to take you on a little mindset shift before we look at the company, which is I want you to think not in terms of tech. We all know Palantir is amazing tech. We know they have deals with the government, with the army. We know it's powering the Ukraine resistance. We know they have the most amazing tech, right? But for this presentation, we're going to shift to a different model, different way of thinking about this, which is the job to be done. We're going to be thinking about what these two companies actually do for customers. So what both UiPath and Palantir do is they pick up data, they transform it into insights, and then they drive efficiency. Sure, Palantir does it in a much more complicated and enigmatic way with an operating system, and UiPath does it in a much simpler and nimbler way, but they do fundamentally the same thing. They help you make sense of data so that you can drive efficiency gains. So what's happening at the moment is these two companies at the surface look as follows. UiPath just watches screens and learns to automate clicks. So it's something that you simply deploy in your organization, and it watches screens across the board. And it just goes like, well, look, these 20 employees, they've been doing the same set of clicks every morning. They're dragging and dropping, and then they're putting this in this folder, and then they're clicking send, right? Think about invoicing. Every time you go through your invoices, it's likely to be the same kind of clicking scheme, right? So this is what UiPath learns to automate. It's called RPA, so robotic process automation. And this is what people think UiPath is now. And it's, of course, not far from reality, but we're going to go deeper. And then Palantir, most of us watching this will know what it is, but it basically deploys an OS for data in your organization to help you make sense of it. So naturally, looking at these two companies at the surface, the narrative is no competition, right? And it's actually, it must be very strange for someone to come along and say, look, hey, I think that they do compete, and they are going to get into a heated competition down the line, if that's your understanding of the two companies. So this is where we begin. So when I say that Palantir competes with UiPath, I'm not talking about the Palantir that the market sees today. I'm talking about the Palantir that's going to be worth likely, because we always talk about these things from a statistical standpoint. The company that's worth $1 trillion in maybe, 10 years time or something like that. For Palantir to get to $1 trillion, it has to productize its offering. So it has to transform Foundry. And I'm talking about the private sector here, by the way, not the public one. It has to transform Foundry into a turnkey solution. It then has to accelerate distribution, so minimizing time to value, and then ultimately become a platform on which companies get built on first. So much like today, people build companies by going on Gmail first and starting an email account. I think that in 10 to 15 years' time, people will build companies by creating their digital twin first, because not doing so just makes you irrelevant, and it makes it really hard to compete. Just like today, you couldn't even begin to think about competing without an email account. It's going to be that straightforward, in my opinion. So what Palantir is doing now is as it gradually productizes, it's moving down market. So we know that Palantir is amazing with the big organizations that have the big bucks. We know it's amazing with the governments. We know it's amazing with military forces, because they have the resources. They're up market, right? These are people with deep pockets. But the way this becomes a 1 trillion market cap company is by going down market and becoming relevant for SMBs. So think about a typical company with maybe 50 employees. The day a company like that can just go onto Palantir.com and deploy their digital twin by just hitting a few buttons, then Palantir is actually going to be more of a platform that people build their companies on first, and it's going to scale way beyond where it's at today, right? So ultimately what it's going to have is way more business at a marginal cost. And that's how we as shareholders today get a massive return. And this is hypothetical, but if you look at the quarterly reports and stuff and you really see what the company is up to, this is what they're doing. And it all comes down to minimizing time to value, so that, as I was saying, eventually an SMB can just go on Palantir.com, click a button, and that's it, digital twin deployed. So, and by the way, this is what I think it looks like once it gets there. Don't be misled by the previous graph. That's just sort of showing what the current dynamic, I think, is. So it basically becomes a platform that spans from the up market to the down market, and it's highly productized. This is where I think we're heading, right? So now onto the competition. What happens is UiPath doesn't compete with Palantir in the up market. It makes no sense. UiPath can't go and power the Ukrainian resistance. It can't go and optimize BP's production cost per barrel from $14 to $6 in a matter of a decade. That's not where it's at. The competition that I see happening is in the down market, as Palantir continues to move in that direction, which is the core of my thesis, right? So going back to the idea of job to be done, where UiPath has a big advantage in the down market is in this part, this one here, so picking up data. So remember that generally with AI, but with data analytics in general, it's whatever capability you have with building algorithms, training algorithms, working with data. If you don't get the data, there's nothing that you can do to create value, right? So data is, it's the oil of our time, and it's the key asset. And so why does UiPath have an advantage here? This is because it picks up data by watching screens through computer vision. And the way it, basically from an architectural standpoint, it sits above the applications, right? So when a company is going to change whatever applications they use pretty often through time, and that requires some management. So managing the stack of a given organization is a source of complexity and of risk. But because UiPath gets data just by watching a screen, that means that companies can just deploy it once and easily, and then just forget about it. So UiPath becomes this companion which is not subject to the chaos at lower levels of the architecture. And it has some negative effects, right? Like the fact that Microsoft can maybe take over their distribution channel one day pretty easily, and that's a different topic. But essentially, these guys can just watch screens and pick up data no matter what stack you use or how it changes over time. And then fundamentally, the upfront cost for customers to get started is so much lower in UiPath than in Palantir that what you get is basically a combination of it culminates in UiPath picking up data much more easily in the SMB space / down market that Palantir currently can. Because Palantir, although the ROI can be much higher, we're talking about companies that maybe don't have the resources to cover the big upfront cost, and that then need to drive automation in a nimble and agile way. Many times they don't have CTOs, many times they don't have technical talent. They just need to drive automation in a way that makes sense for their very small pockets, right?
Can you build on some people in the chat are asking what a down market is? Can you build on that hypothesis a little bit more?
Yeah, sure.
What is UiPath actually, or what people are they trying to target in the down market?
Sure. So thanks, Hamid. So what I mean by down market is basically companies that just don't have the huge pockets. So like the best example of an up market company can be something like Apple, right? I think they're worth like 3 trillion now. Spain outputs 1 trillion per year. So that's up market. Down market can be, if I set up a company, a startup tomorrow, and I have something like 15, 20 employees or something, and I really don't have that much money to be splashing around, I'm down market. So what that means is I can't just walk up to Palantir and be like, yeah, I'll pay 500K to deploy a digital twin. It's like, no, look, I have, maybe crazy scenario. I have something like, 4 million in funding, and I can't do that. I can't spend, 20% of my funding on a digital twin. So the majority of companies on earth today are in that space. The minority of companies on earth today are in the up market, like Apple or Tyson Foods or BP, which is a fantastic business case regarding Palantir's ability to optimize operations. They are the minority. They are Palantir's current customers, but they already have that customer base. And Palantir is not at $1 trillion market cap. The way it gets there is just by embracing the rest of the market massively, by making it really easy to deploy digital twins, so that these SMBs, which make up for the majority of companies on the planet, can leverage this technology, right?
And your thesis is also that these SMBs, they're going to recognize, just like in the 2000s, if you didn't have a .com presence, you were dead. They're going to slowly or rapidly start to recognize if they don't have a digital twin, their competitors will eat them up. And that's where they're going to be looking for basically the cheapest way to get the job done.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I can just quickly break down the mental model that leads me there. This is of help to the audience. I believe I don't have a graph for this, but maybe I can find a relevant one. No, I don't, but I'll just go with it quickly. So basically, if you think about what a company is, it's basically an optimization function. It's basically a box that has to minimize inputs and maximize outputs. So you want to put the least amount of stuff, resources, money, time into it, and maximize the profits. And nowadays, the good impact on the world that you can through time, right? So in order to minimize inputs and maximize outputs, what companies do is they just process information from the market. They take it in, and then they go like, well, these are the levers that we can pull to minimize inputs, maximize outputs. And this is true for any organization, even nonprofit ones. This is all humanity has ever done to create wealth. So companies such as that, and therefore the more information that you can process at a lower cost, typically the better your organization tends to do through time. And so we can extend this a bit further. I'll just give you this quickly before moving on. But if you look at what makes the greatest companies on earth today, like Microsoft, Apple, stuff like that, is they have cultures that are optimized to basically enable information to flow within and throughout the organization in the best way possible. So, and these companies then die. Like General Electric was an amazing company. I think it was #1 by market cap not too long ago, and it died. I mean, it's still alive, but it's no longer half of what it was because it got political and information wasn't flowing, right? So this is what companies are. Therefore, digital twins, they just boost the company's ability to do what it does. So it's going to be a basic, in my opinion.
Yeah, makes sense.
Cool. So then going back to the thesis, as I was explaining, UiPath has this advantageous position from which to pick up data. And then I know what everyone else is thinking, which is what I was thinking in the beginning too, which is UiPath is nowhere near Palantir in terms of its capacity to manage data. So UiPath is, we can look at it as an empty shell, right? So, Palantir is the result of decades of compounding knowledge in terms of how to manage data for clients across highly sensitive verticals like, the military, healthcare, finance, government in general. No one's going to beat them on that end. And I'm certainly not saying that UiPath is going to beat them there. But what I do think is that Palantir is positioned to not disrupt Palantir, but to give them some pretty heated competition for a number of reasons. One, UiPath has a really high retention rate. And this is because even though it's a Romanian company, and some of my followers were saying, hey, I would never take a Romanian company seriously. Look, at first glance, neither would I. But if you look under the hood, you can see that actually the company has a really high net retention rate. And that's because customers, once they deploy the solution in their enterprise, they do so in one division, like accounting, and then they find quick value. So they see the ROI, return on investment, and apparently this is quite reliable and representative across the customer base. And then they add it in other divisions. Then they deploy it in finance. Then they deploy it in supply chain management, in a number of things. So then the net retention is very high. It was 127 last quarter, excluding the FX impact. And it's actually come down from something like 140 over the last year with the B2B sales pipeline slowing down. And we've seen that across a number of companies. So I believe this just tracks the macro environment. So customers really love this thing. And I know that other people were saying in Twitter, well, my company deployed it and it sucked and we got rid of it. It's not going to work with every customer, but it seems to be doing so. And with some pretty big customers too. I don't have the examples here, unfortunately, I missed that. But they are working across different verticals like healthcare. I believe they signed a deal with the largest healthcare a chain. I think it was in New Jersey. I'll bring up the examples on Twitter, but some very notable ones. So customers love it. And so what I hypothesize can happen over time in the down markets, right? So in the SMB space, small and medium companies, is that UiPath accumulates more data than Palantir, just because they have a distribution advantage and they have a high retention. So again, going back to the distribution, why? Because if you're an SMB, you're not going to pay $600K to get your digital twin going first to see what happens. You're going to have a propensity to pay someone like UiPath because you're going to be like, well, I have to get into automation. That makes sense. Okay, let me start by automating invoices. So then you go to UiPath, which is 15 to 25K just to deploy, and you're going to begin to see those returns. So this is what I hypothesize can happen. However, and I know what everyone else is thinking, well, we all agree that actually Palantir's automation is much more valuable than UiPath's, right? Because Palantir can do amazing things like, save Ukraine, and it's literally amazing. Every time I say it, I can't believe it. They can reduce the cost of production per oil of barrel for BP from $14 to $6. It's amazing. And I don't actually doubt that. Of course, Palantir's automation is of much higher value than UiPath's at the moment. But here's what's happening fundamentally. As I was saying, Palantir is moving from the up market to the down market, and the automation value is high. And I think that's going to be the case as they move down market because they already have that capability. And UiPath is coming from the down market with low automation value, but actually it's the value of the workloads that it is able to automate is going up. And so one example of this is semantic automation, which is basically the understanding of language. So just allow me to illustrate why that is of higher value. Think about going back to the definition of what a company is, so minimizing inputs and maximizing outputs. The way a company does that, the way employees and just people inside a company do that is by processing language. So there's going to be numbers involved for sure. But basically, numbers then get translated into reports that encapsulate information. Hey, I think we should do this. Okay, these are the 10 ideas that we derive from these numbers. Let's evaluate these. Let's understand them. Let's take a decision. That's all semantic in nature. So the way UiPath is able to do semantic automation is by just watching screens and developing the tech to understand the content of documents. So once UiPath is able to tap into that, they are able to automate more than invoices and clicks. They're able to do things like, for instance, they could have understood the content of my deep dive on UiPath, and they could have created this presentation for me automatically, which took me a couple of hours to do, right? So it basically taps into the core mechanism of a company and enables that company to just get so much more done in the semantic context than they would otherwise. And that's just a way of saying that it just helps the company get much smarter than otherwise. And actually, if that rings the bell with what respect to Palantir does, is because it's pretty much the same, except that they're coming from the up market and they obviously already reside at much higher levels of automation value. But they're gonna, in my opinion, they're gonna crash a collision course around down here. And again, I think it was kind of hard to put everything into one graph. This doesn't mean that Palantir is going to stay in the down market. It's probably going to be vertically positioned here, and then UiPath could move up market too. And in fact, they do serve a large number of big organizations. But the point is that these two companies are set to collide here, right?
And so your argument is the robotic processing automation. To my understanding, Palantir doesn't track your clicks or anything like that. They take data from silos and try to put them into a common foundation of truth, this ontology. You're saying what Palantir's ontology is similar to what UiPath internally can build for the organization by simply doing this RPA throughout every sector of the institution. And as a result, essentially create a quote unquote ontology. I know it's not exactly an ontology, but essentially create an understanding that's a little bit, you could argue, even deeper of the organization than Palantir, because you're literally seeing what every employee is doing at scale, correct?
Yeah, that's a perfect way of framing it. And then Palantir, I believe one of my followers sent me a snapshot of a document from Palantir in which Palantir says that they can develop RPA for you. And so, but that's if you go a little bit deeper, of course Palantir can do that, but that's not the point. The point
Right.
is that the company that's currently selling RPA and that's scaling it in a way that's appealing to the SMB space, so for small, medium companies, is UiPath at the moment. And so, as you were saying, Amit, that's absolutely correct. They are basically positioned with that infrastructure to then, and I'm going to explain that next, they are positioned to iterate their way towards higher value automation of workflows, right? So maybe if you're an SMB, you're not going to need the same level of operation optimization as the US Air Force or as Tyson Foods or as British Petroleum, but you are going to be able probably to get a degree of automation and ontology from UiPath that's going to be enough for you to really do better, much better than you would otherwise, at a price that you can afford, right?
Right. No, this makes sense. This makes sense.
Okay, cool. So then, why do I think that UiPath can move from here to here? And actually, just before we do that, why do I think that Palantir can move from here to here? Because they're doing that. As most of us know, they've gone from being a consulting firm to, I'd say at this stage, reasonably productized. And that's just the direction they're moving at. The reason that I think UiPath can move in this direction is because they have this track record of essentially being an iteration machine. So they have and it's actually a very young company. They only really began to gain traction 5 years ago, which is incredible. And the founder, David Dimes, bootstrapped the company for 10 years before that. So it's an incredible story, a very unlikely case of success. But anyways, they have this track record of constantly iterating while maintaining, sorry for the typo, very high retention rates. So it looks to me like an iteration machine. And then if some of my readers are here, they will know that this is a property that I look for in companies, because this is sort of what makes some of the world's best companies in the world today. So if you look at Amazon, it is fundamentally an iteration machine. So what it does is just make new bets constantly and then pursue each one with this non-stop way of just iterating through it and focusing on giving value to customers. This is the fundamental nature of this company too. So if you just add that dynamic into the graph that I was explaining previously, and you see where the company is at, if you add this component, the fact that is it likely or not that over time it can move to a higher automation value? For me, I think it's quite likely, so long as they maintain the distribution advantage and the high retention rates. Because if they just continue to deploy across new organizations and they sit above the application layer and they can just observe what each person in the company is doing in this very nimble and agile way, right? So no crazy deployment of $500,000, just, hey, pay us 15, 25K, let us deploy on your screens. And then from that point onwards, UiPath has access to this whole massive pool of unstructured data that the other apps are fighting for. So to illustrate this, imagine a company uses Excel and the other one uses numbers. So Excel from Microsoft, numbers from Apple. These two companies, Microsoft and Apple, in that context, are fighting for the data that these companies are going to develop. One in Excel, the other in numbers. And that's a tough contest that obviously at scale Microsoft is winning, because it's just the default productivity app, Excel, across finance and everything. But they're going to be quarreling in that space. And then the organization that hires apps is going to be constantly changing their app stack. But UiPath sits above that. So it's very nimble, it's very agile. And so long as it keeps distributing fast in the SMB space and retaining its customers, which it really is, because I haven't seen net retention rates this high very often, if at all, in the past year of all the companies that I've looked at. So long as it can do that and it continues to iterate, this is where it's going to meet Palantir. And then, of course, maybe just in case some people joined just now, I'm not saying this is going to happen in 2 3 months or 6 or even 2 years, but I have a feeling, I think the odds are very high that this is going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years, and then this is going to become a relevant narrative. Because, and just to recap, although the Palantir has the best ontology software in the world at the moment, in my opinion, for the folks down here in the down market, and I can empathize a lot because I've been down there. I was an entrepreneur for a while, and it was blood, sweat, and tears the whole time, and I know what it's like to be down here. UiPath has a very interesting selling proposition, and the company is definitely evolving in a direction which I think is worth having in mind for Palantir investors. So I believe this is the end of the presentation.
Okay. That was awesome. That was great. We got a bunch of questions in the chat, so we'll get into it. So, no, this is really interesting. The way I'm interpreting this is that in the small business space, which obviously Palantir has to be able to expand into in order for them to be able to really expand the commercial sector. You know, Karp has talked about modularizing the product and making sure they can attack those SMBs. Your argument is that that's fine, but there's a company already doing that. It's way cheaper. Palantir historically has not had the best sales culture. And so if there's a company already attacking SMBs with an offering that's pretty similar for what an SMB, what a startup would look like, it doesn't need a $50 million deal. It just needs, 20, 30,000 a month. And there's a massive scale from there, given their robotic processing automation software. One question I want to ask you, then we'll get into some questions in the chat. Do you think RPA is the key moat that creates the digital twin? Or do you think that digital twin can be created in other ways? So, for example, let's say Palantir modularizes a product, puts it into SMBs. Let's say they get some sales right, but they don't have RPA. Is that the thing that makes you think there's no other real competitors because they haven't nailed RPA and they've not put in the R&D that UPI has put in over the past 10 years to really get it done? And is that also a big part of the bull thesis for why, look, other companies just can't do it as well as UiPath?
Yeah, that's an awesome question, Amit. So in this context, RPA is just a data source. So the way Palantir gets data is by deploying this very bulky, although meaningful and powerful OS across an organization. Right. And that's one way of getting data. RPA is just about watching screens through computer vision and then picking up that data without the bulky deployment of an OS. So it's kind of the shortcut to get data. And then just to answer the second half, once you have that data, it doesn't mean that you then, of course, automatically have an ontology. That's where I think no one currently can beat Palantir. But what you do have is the data. So then you can do stuff with the data so long as you're the gatekeeper. So if your company has this ability to just constantly try new stuff and has left this trail of success in the past, where it's just constantly launching new features and customers are like, give this to me. And net retention rates are high and keep going up, except for the last year with the macro headwinds. Then it's like you can use the data you get from the RPA to iterate your way towards something that looks like an ontology. And then so long as you do that in the SMB space, then it begins to be a threat for Palantir that's coming down from the up market to the bottom market, because these companies are very resource constrained. So you could, and I've had this experience before, you could have a conversation with a company with little resources and say, look, I think this is going to shoot up your efficiency by 500%, but you got to pay this really high price up front. And then people are not always like that, because not everyone is going to be a Karp, not everyone is going to be a Steve Jobs. People that operate these companies are not always mavericks, right? So although they are in many ways, but what I'm saying is that you don't need a full ontology like Palantir's to compete in that space. But and what you need for sure is a distribution advantage. So to illustrate the case, you see how in cybersecurity, for instance, you have CrowdStrike, and they are winning, right, in the XDR space. Why? Because cybersecurity now, is about getting more data than everyone else, and then training an AI to keep the bad guys away, better than human defined software could, right?
Right.
So whoever wins in the cybersecurity space is because they got more data than anyone else, and that comes down to distribution. So this is the same. If you want to deliver value to companies in the SMB space, you need to get the most data possible per vertical, and then be able to use that data to train AIs to generate insights and therefore automation, and therefore cut OPEX as a percentage of revenue. So that's how I see the picture.
Before we get into the audience questions, are you a fan of the valuation at 9.8 billion? Is that something you care about right now, or not much?
Yeah, I mean, it's something I definitely looked at. That's a price to sales of 8, which I think reflects that the market is not totally a miss of the opportunity. But what I like to buy is companies that are just totally mispriced. And I may be wrong, and I am very often, of course, but I like to buy companies. So say if UiPath was priced at like 1.5 times sales, this would be a screaming buy for me. At 8, it's a very interesting play. And I actually, there's 2 things that I need to unlock from the thesis that I haven't mentioned. But basically, and this is very important for the audience, UiPath has basically rented a space in Microsoft's ecosystem, because the operating system that's used most across enterprises is Windows, right? So
Right.
why can Microsoft not use their own distribution advantage, which is the fact that they don't even have to watch screens, they just have access directly to the OS? Why can't they build an RPA that just blows these guys out of the water? Well, it actually seems that it's not that easy for Microsoft, and it looks like a scenario termed as the innovation stack by Jim McKelvey, the co-founder of Square, now Block. He called it like that. And basically the story is, why didn't Amazon kill Block in 2014 when it came down to kill its merchant business? Why did Amazon give up a year later and then send to all the customers that it acquired Square's merchant solution? And that's because Square had spent years focusing exclusively on this part, on that part of its business, and it had eventually built a moat, which was the result of thousands of incremental value additions that then Amazon just couldn't compete with in a year, no matter the resources, right? So I think that this is what's happening in UiPath versus Microsoft. But I'm 60% sure. I'm not 95, 90% sure as I need to be. So it's something that I plan to look out for. But that's I think the major thing that I am pending to unlock the long thesis right now.
It's a really interesting argument. I've been exploring it a lot more as well. I mean, it's also your thesis on Spotify, right? That Apple and Amazon should have killed Spotify, but they exclusively focus on music. They exclusively focus on audio, and they're at more than 500 million users now. And so as a result of that, it's hard to get someone out of the water when they have an obsession over one thing. And I mean, theoretically, it could be the same with UiPath and RPA. If they are obsessed with this and they just know it better than everyone else, even if you have distribution, it sometimes isn't the easiest thing to just kill it off immediately and keep going.
Yeah,
okay,
that's totally it.
Cool. So Antonio's Twitter and Substack is in the chat. Please make sure to check it out. Let's get some questions from the chat. Martin says, question, can you explain how UiPath will move to higher automation value? At the moment, it is quite simple, something like a macro, which is why the product is cheap. So I guess, can you expand on how do they take the RPA data and move it from something to like a Palantir use case, for example, maybe not a BP 14-6, but something that's higher with the data that they can use?
Yeah, cool. That's an awesome question. So the way UiPath started off is by just watching how people clicked on things on a screen, and it was picking up that data through computer vision. So by training an AI with that data, it was just able to automate clicks, and that's how it got going. Now, in the last quarter, the company launched a feature called Clipboard AI. And so Clipboard AI does fundamentally the same thing. It watches the screen, but it is now on its way, apparently, to being able to understand the content of documents. So if this succeeds, which I argue that it's likely that it will, because UiPath is an iteration machine and it is able to just constantly deliver more and better features to customers. If it succeeds, it's going to go from just being able to automate clicks to do something like the following. So see this example. Imagine that the software could eventually tell exactly what's going on in your supply chain just by reading the emails across the organization. So it's going to be picking up the data of what one supplier sent to one of the controllers, what the other supplier sent. It's going to do that across the board, and then it's going to gain an understanding of what is happening in the supply chain. Here's another example. Imagine you have a sales team, and they have the following process in the sales team. They are given a report, and so with all the information they need to close the deal, and then they are given the instructions to close a specific deal. Okay, so then the sales team goes out and then they execute. So they're going to maybe use resources like a presentation and stuff. Imagine, and this is where the company is heading again with Clipboard AI, that the software is able to watch that process being repeated at scale across the organization many times. It's going to learn what report correlates to what presentation in order to maximize the chances of success in the sales process. Is that well explained? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And so theoretically, you think, I don't think it replaces a salesperson, but if you could, I mean, I've seen a lot of AI startups basically try to say, hey, we're going to record your sales call, and then we're going to use, something like a GPT function to give you the best insights on how the sales call could have been better. Your argument is, if they could automate a sales process to an extent, the amount of increase in revenue, which that could also lead to, could be pretty interesting for a company as well.
Correct. So that's absolutely it, Amit. So they just go from automating clicks to then being able to help boost the performance of the sales unit division. Right. And that's just by understanding semantically what's being written down in documents, and then how that correlates to the ultimate goal of minimizing inputs, maximizing outputs. And what's cool about that is they don't have to redo their infrastructure. They just pick up the data from screens. What they have to do is work on the back end so that they get the semantic understanding right. But again, the core asset of this is just the data, which they already have access to because they have such high retention rates, and then they're able to just deploy the solution much faster than Palantir or other players.
Oh, it's very, very interesting. Any thoughts on C3 AI as an RPA competitor?
I don't. I'd have to, I'm sorry, Jackalope. I have to look at them in detail to answer that. I don't want to BS my way out of that.
Yeah, I didn't even know C3 AI does RPA, to be honest. So
neither did I, but I'll check them out.
Another question here. Where is it? Oh, does UiPath just recognize and suggest processes that could be automated, or does it also provide the automation solution?
Well, they actually don't specify that in their public filings, but I wouldn't think about it. I wouldn't think about that in that way. So what they have access to is the data, which is the core asset. And so once you have access to that data and you can see how it correlates to outcomes, you're able to do the two. So they're in a position to do the two wherever the customer wants, basically. That's my answer.
Cool. I know you answered this already, but I'll give you one more shot. What prevents Palantir from offering the same simple application like UiPath?
Nothing. But they need to get on it, is my take. And that's ultimately the value that, I mean, of course, it's cool to evaluate UiPath as a standalone investment opportunity. I think it's good enough. But then, what does Palantir need to do to get down into that SMB space and move towards that $1 trillion market cap? They should be doing this, in my opinion. That's why I was saying I could promise that this was going to help you understand the company better.
Right. No, and that's what I appreciate about the thesis, because it's not anything other than what it is, which is that this is something to think about, and it's important to kind of recognize that. And it brings up a really good point. I was just talking to Sachin on Sunday, and he said he is hopeful that Palantir figures out sales, but he's not confident. And I think that's what a lot of he's all in on Palantir in one of his portfolios, and it's like he's hopeful they figure out sales, but he's not confident because the company hasn't shown signs that shareholders should be confident that they will figure out sales. And part of sales is small businesses. The product doesn't sell to small businesses because the product is the product. You need a sales representative who's able to get that done for a company that's resource constrained on cash. So it's definitely a very valid point.
I'll give you one more data point, which is really relevant to what you're saying, which is there's this amazing interview that I make reference to in my written deep dive with David Dines, the founder of the company. And the interviewer asked him, well, how did UiPath get ahead of the rest of the RPA players? Because just back in 2017, it was way behind. And the answer was so simple. He said, we were just humble and we would listen to customers and give them what they want. And right, isn't that sort of, doesn't that ring a bell with respect to Palantir and sales? So the bear thesis, the Palantir bear thesis for me is arrogant. Right. So this is what we need to be watching.
Right. Okay, we'll do one last question. Maybe you have an answer, maybe not. Any information with how UiPath works with sensitive information, confidential stuff, to make sure stuff doesn't get leaked or any bad things happens with the data?
They seem to be competent because, as I was saying, if you read through the quarterly calls, they give examples of the customers that they work with. And I'm going to have to unbury these. I have them in my notes. I actually didn't even include them in my write-up, but they work with customers across finance, healthcare, some in government too, apparently, if I'm not mistaken. So they work in very sensitive domains, but I don't find any single events that really show that they excel on that front. Like Palantir, for instance, they run the nuclear stockpile of the US. So that's one data point that lets you know that these guys, Palantir is really good at this. With UiPath, I actually haven't found data points like that, but they seem to be competent, but not, I wouldn't count on necessarily on them beating Palantir on that front. I wouldn't.
Okay. Sounds good to me. This was awesome. Great thesis, great presentation. The one thing I appreciate about you, Antonio, a lot every time we talk is that you make people think about investing. I think that's why your Substack is taking off. That's why you have a following. His Twitter and Substack is in the chat. I highly recommend checking it out. If you read one of his pieces, it will take you likely a couple of hours to actually read it and understand it. And I think in this world of like hype videos and stuff, actually sitting down with a piece and just spending time with it because you spent sometimes months with these companies, it's super valuable. And it's for free. It's for fucking free. It's free, which is amazing.
All right. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Always is.
Thank you, Antonio. Thank you, everybody. Please follow him on Twitter. It's in the description. And we'll see you guys on the next one. Bye, everyone.
See you, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.